Yes, I just had a thing removed from my head. Okay, thank you. All right, I'll switch that back. All right, and I'll reset that. And we will get started. All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the first of the series of presentations in the online ColdFusion Summit. They will be offered throughout the next several weeks, really a few months probably, where each of the presenters who had presented at the CF Summit in Vegas are going to repeat their presentations. And these should be being recorded. Yep, I see the recording button. Apurva, I hope you'll also edit out all the stuff that was prior to this. And you can do that. You can, in Connect's recording feature, you can edit out all the stuff that was at the front. No need for all that to be waded through. So we get started. All right. And with that, I'll get started with my talk, which is how the Adobe CF Docker images have evolved. And my name is Charlie Arehart, and you can reach out to me there via social media or all kinds of things. That's the same. Arehart is the same on the Slack and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and so on. And you can also reach out to me by email, charlie@carehart.org. And I do look forward to your feedback. I'd love it if you would let folks know what you think of the talk, pro or con. We always appreciate feedback, good or bad. It's how we learn. And let's go ahead and get started. So in this talk, first I'm going to do some introduction because some of you are coming from different levels of experience, either with the ColdFusion Docker images or with Docker itself. So we'll do a few introductory topics to get started. And then jump into the meat of the session, which is how the CF 2021 images were improved in some significant ways over those that were released for CF 2018 and CF 2016. And some may be surprised to hear that there were some, but there were. In particular, of the most importance to some people is that their size has gotten much smaller. And then what may surprise some people, if you aren't aware of it, is the incredible flexibility they now have for modularizing what's in the images as you build them or on the fly as you run them, and the configurability to have the CF administrator configured appropriately, and so many other things. And it's a big surprise for some people when they may first learn about this stuff. I'll also talk about how, and that'll be the bulk of the presentation, more than half of it will be that. And then I'll also, towards the last third probably, will be how the CF 2021 images have changed since their initial release and how the CF 2018 images have changed as well. Just want you to be aware of those things. Sometimes there's surprises that might delight people or surprise them in any way. And then I'll also mention the Performance Monitoring Toolset and the API Manager. They also have images, and I'll talk about how those have evolved since their initial release. So, some of this will make more sense as we go through the talk. Quickly about myself, I'm an independent consultant, don't work for anybody. I work for a lot of different people. I have hundreds of clients and actively help them, mostly solving troubleshooting issues related to CF or Lucy or Tomcat in general. And I help people with administering and configuring and tuning and migrating and updating CF especially, and also helping people with containerization. So I've been helping people use the Adobe CF images as well as the command box images and even the Lucy images. But in this talk, this is an Adobe CF Summit talk, so we're just talking here about the Adobe ColdFusion images. And some of you may know that I'm a longtime contributor to the community in various ways, various resources that you can find on my website, which again is carehart.org. And you can look at the bottom right corner, every one of my slides. If you ever at that moment think, hey, I want to ask about something, I want to look something up, just there it is, carehart.org, first initial, last name, Arehart. By the way, this is a good opportunity for me to stop and say, I'm not Carasoft, Carahsoft, Carahsoft, Carasoft. That's a company that Adobe works with. They often host webinars and stuff like that, and I think they resell ColdFusion. I have nothing to do with Carasoft, just coincidental that we share the first same letters. And then I'm not Carhartt either, of course. No. Anyway, moving on. So who is this talk for? Well, I'm really talking to those who are already using ColdFusion's images and deploying ColdFusion containers with the Adobe ColdFusion images. If you're using something else, you'll get value out of it. Still, you'll see why as I get through it. If you're new to Docker and containers, you'll still get value out of it. I'm just saying, so follow along. and we'll assess how these images have evolved since their introduction. And they first came out in 2018, so they've been out for 4 years. Some people are only learning about them now. We'll learn about aspects of how they work, how they've evolved and how they work, how they can be configured, things I already talked about. But I want to be clear, this is not an introduction to Docker, and it's not an introduction to why you should use Docker. And some of you perhaps are coming along because it's just the first talk of the online CF Summit. And you think, what the heck, I might learn something. Well, I hope you will, but I want to be clear that this is not a talk where I'm going to explain what Docker is or explain certain facets of using it. Just, forgive me for that. We don't have time. We have so much to cover and just what we're going to cover, but I'll point you to some resources that will help you, and we'll leave it at that. So just get what you can out of it. I hope somebody will help you get started. Most importantly, help you work with them better if you're already using them. That's my goal. It's also not an overview of all the capability of these CF images. They have a lot more capability than I'm going to cover. Again, I'm focusing on how they've changed and evolved. So there's things I won't cover. But again, don't let that dismay you. I'm just saying, trust me, there's much more I could have covered. And I have in some previous sessions at previous CF summits. I've done introductions to the Cold Fusion Docker images. At the last Into the Box, I did a overview comparing the images from Adobe and Lucy and Command Box. And if you're interested in that kind of distinction, again, I have a whole separate talk on that. I'll point it out later. But I'm just letting you know that I've got past talks. Sorry, that was a clock I set up to make sure I'm keeping an eye on the time. All my slides, all the presentations and recordings, often of almost every presentation, are available at my site, and it's carehart.org/presentations. If you just go to the carehart.org site and look for the button that says presentations, you'll find it. And this presentation, by the way, is already there. So if any of you are the sort that see a URL and want to write it down, don't worry about it. Just go get the slides. The PDF is already up on my website with this information, and you can get it and follow along and look ahead if you want. But, try to avoid that because you'll get distracted and miss something that I say. And then you have to go back and listen to the recording. And I'll post that recording as soon as Adobe shares what the URL will be. I'll post that as well on my website. So as far as finding out more about these Adobe CF Docker images, I just want to make sure you know this, because some people don't. They just, if you just Google Cold Fusion Docker images, this should be the first thing that comes up. But sometimes people just don't seem to think to do that. And so they don't ever see this page. And I want to go ahead and take you there right now. So let me hop out to my browser. There. All right, I thought I'd put these in the order I would refer to them. So this is that page. Again, if you just Google Cold Fusion Docker images, it'll take you to this page. It's a page in the docs now. So over on the left, these are other sections of the Cold Fusion docs, and indeed other manuals. And this happens to be in the one called Introduction to Cold Fusion. There's all these other manuals that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But in there, one of the pages is these Docker images for CF. And, this is old news from over a year ago, so I wish they would just remove it. It's not really important anymore. But they go on to talk about the images, where they are. I'll talk about that more. They talk about the tags. I'll talk about that as well. They talk about the EULA and the environment variables. And look, I'm just paging down. This thing goes on and on and on. It would be several pages, probably about a dozen pages. In fact, let's do a quick Control P. Yeah, it'd be 12 pages. So this is a lot of stuff, 12 pages worth of content. You should come and read it if you're going to work with these Cold Fusion Docker images. Don't just watch videos. Don't just ask questions on Slack or Twitter or the community forums. Read the docs. It's one page of docs. You'll learn so much. Trust me, I help people every day with this. There are so many things that they just miss because they don't read the docs. And then there's other folks like myself, David Byers, Dan Skaggs, Pete Freitag, have done blog posts or presentations, and you can find them in various ways. So first of all, if you go to my site, carehart.org, my blog, if you just ask for the Docker category, you'll find I've posted several different blog entries. Also on the Adobe Cold Fusion portal, which if you didn't know it, it's coldfusion.adobe.com. On that portal, it also has blog posts and could have videos and stuff like that. And there's tags there. And if you look for the tag for Docker, you'll find others have tagged their resources with that. And then I'm going to talk later in this talk about a site I've created called Awesome CF Compose. And it's built on one that Docker created called Awesome Compose. And I'll talk more about that later, but there's the URL for that. And I want to make sure you know about this, cfswarm.inleague.io. Now, Swarm was and is still a feature available in Docker to do orchestration. And by and large, the world has gone to Kubernetes instead. So Swarm kind of fell by the wayside. It's still useful. It might still be something you'd want to use. But the point is, a few years ago, the folks at this company, InLeague, started to write a guide on using Docker images for Cold Fusion and all about that and all the ins and outs of it. And they primarily now focus on the Lucy images, but you can still get a lot of great value out of understanding, just in general, some concepts and topics of interest. Because there's some ways that we using Docker images might be a little different than the way people using other things would use them. So anyway, check that out. Check these resources out. Again, this is not a talk introducing you to Docker, so I'm pointing you to these resources to go learn more. And in particular, if you go to the portal, David Byers has done a couple blog posts about it. And then I didn't list this, but if you go to the Cold Fusion meetup site, Dan Skaggs did a presentation. In fact, I think he did one at CF Summit. That's right. So it's also, you'll find it at the portal in their recordings area. Dan Skaggs had done a talk on Docker, and his and Pete's were definitely more on the line of introducing you to it. So again, there's plenty of places to find more introducing you to it. That's the point I want to make. All right, so about the images themselves, and this is where I'm kicking gear into the gear to talk about people that already understand Docker. They are now all available via Dockerhub, and here's the site. If you just go to Dockerhub and search for Cold Fusion, you will find it. Appears a search, and it's just dockerhub.com will get you here, and you would find with a search for Cold Fusion that the first thing that comes up is the verified publisher site for Adobe Cold Fusion. And notice they start with Adobe Cold Fusion, Adobe Cold Fusion, Adobe Cold Fusion, and there's different repositories, they call them, with different names, but the owner of the repository is Adobe Cold Fusion. So if you click on this button, you see all of their repositories. So there's Cold Fusion, and then they split out 2018 and 2021, or you can just use this. And then they're all the same images. There's just different tags in here. We'll talk about that later. In fact, let me just show you real quickly. In this one called Adobe Cold Fusion, if you scroll down, there's tags, and there's tags for latest 2018, latest 2021. And then if you go into the ones for specifically 2018, 2021, then you see tags for the specific versions. There's 2018, 15, 2018, 14, and so on. And 2021 has 0.5. And those correspond to the updates. Those of you that know about Cold Fusion updates know that update 15 had just come out for CF 2018 last month, and update 5 for CF 2021 came out last month. So there's a separate image for each version of CF, each product version, and then within each version there's a separate image for each update. And if you want to, you can say I want to use this particular update, which by the way means you don't need to update the images. You know, if you're currently on CF 2018 update 14 and you want to go to 15 with a regular normal implementation of Cold Fusion, you'd apply the update. But with the Docker images, you just go get the new image that has the update already baked into it. And again, there's a lot there that I'm not getting into that maybe loses some of you who are new to Docker. But the point is there are different images for each version. There's different tags and therefore different images for each update level. So that's the Docker Hub page. And then they also deploy them and make them available through Amazon's Elastic Container Registry, ECR. And if you just went to the ECR site and search for Cold Fusion, you'd find them. But again, it's that /Adobe, and I've already got it up here. So there's /Adobe. And again, within that, they've got different repositories for Cold Fusion add-ons, Cold Fusion 2018, and on and on and on. And all those ones were there too. And I didn't show them there, but while we're here, let me just show you. There's an image for the API manager. There's an image for the performance monitoring tool set. And there's one for PMT 2021 as well as 2018. And I'll talk about those briefly later on. But the point is they're all just different, what are called repositories. And the way this interface works, same thing. You go here and you see what tags there are. And if we look at the 2021, for example, again, this is just setting the groundwork for understanding how to use this stuff. It's not really the focus of the talk, although these are reflections of how they've evolved. You know, as each update comes out, there's 2021, 05, 04, 03, 02, and each of those has a different URI. And if I were to copy that to the clipboard, I could go to the command line and say Docker pull that or Docker run that, and it would just work. So that's cool. All right. And I want to throw out as well, for those of you that get into this stuff, you may come across resources that may confuse you a bit. There was a time, believe it or not, from the first time they released them in May of 2018 until September of 2021, that was the only way to get those images was not to go to Dockerhub, not to go to ECR, but you had to go to this thing called JFrog's bin tray. So that was a repository that existed, and that product and service was finally sunsetted in mid 2021. And so you could no longer add things to them. They let them stay there for a while, but eventually by September, they weren't able to be even retrieved. So you cannot, if you find anything that tries to use them with that URL, eapps, blah, 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 that's just not the right thing to be using anymore. So just switch it to using the ones from Dockerhub or ECR. All right, and we've already looked at the repositories. I just went ahead and did that, so we'll go ahead and move on. I'm keeping an eye on any questions. Don't see any yet. So we saw that those registries offered for each of the different versions, images for CF. The add-ons, I didn't discuss this, but let me just say this now for those who don't know. If you ever install ColdFusion, you get asked, do you want to implement these other things like Solar? And they say PDFG, but they really mean support for CF HTML to PDF. That's a tag that was added in CF 11. And that runs as a separate service normally. Well, they can be run as separate containers in the case of ColdFusion. And so there's an image for add-ons if you want to run them as their own image. There's an image for the PMT, which is a monitor that was introduced in CF 2018 and is still there in 2021, will be for a long time. So you should check that out. And by the way, this is another thing I want to throw out. If you're interested in trying things like this out, but you don't feel like you want to install them on your machine, well, use the Docker images. And I'm going to show you in a moment how easy it is to run, for example, the PMT via Docker, and you don't install anything. You just get the Docker images and run them and configure things so that they are what run. And when you stop the images, they stop running, and there's no service to deal with. There's no software to install or uninstall other than Docker and getting these images. But again, I'm getting a little bit beyond the focus of the talk, so let me just move on. So there's the API manager as well. And for those who didn't know, that came out with CF 2016. It's included with a ColdFusion Enterprise license. You do need a ColdFusion Enterprise license to use it. But the point is, you don't have to install the API manager. If you just want to try it out, there's no free trial. But if you have an enterprise license key, you can put that enterprise license key and run that API manager as an image and a container. And it's got its own set of add-ons for those that get into doing that. So there you go. Each one of these has its own repository, and then the tags reflect the updates as Adobe offers updates. And I didn't show you, but let me go back to, for instance, this one and just pick any one at all, like this one. When I first came into this ColdFusion 2018, I was on this overview tab, and the overview tab of all of these containers, by and large, talks about how to get them, how to use them, what are some of the basic environment variables you can use. Again, for those who know this stuff, if you do Docker already, you know about setting environment variables. And then they talk about running them and finding out more about them. So there's an available help command. There's also an available info command that you can pass. So again, I covered these back in those talks where I introduced the images. That's not the focus of this talk. But the point is, this does tell you that. And remember, this page definitely tells you that. All that stuff about info, it's in there, how to get the info command. Okay, so I'll leave you to explore that on your own later. And they often do point to this page, but sometimes they don't. So that's why I wanted to make sure you were remembering. Just Google ColdFusion Docker images, and you'll find this page first and foremost. All right, and that's that page we're talking about. Okay, so let's run some examples. Enough introduction. Let's go ahead and see some stuff working, see how it really works. And I'm going to be showing them using what's called Docker Compose. For those who don't use it, don't worry. It's pretty simple. When I show you, you'll go, okay, I get it. And then if you don't currently use them and you prefer to use Docker files, that's cool. You can use Docker files. I don't generally, for various reasons, not because I don't want to, but just for the sake of keeping this simple and creating that site called Awesome CF Compose. It was focused on Compose, so I kind of went nuts and used Compose files for everything. I'm probably going to change it soon to also offer Docker files. I have an example. I'll show you one And again, if you've never used this stuff or if you've never used Docker, it'll still make generally pretty good sense. And like I said, all this stuff I'm about to show you is on my GitHub project called Awesome CF Compose. And you probably haven't heard anybody talk about it. I haven't really, promoted it because I wanted to make sure some things were there, a good kind of starting point. And I'm also refining some things. I might even change it to not be Awesome CF Compose, but maybe Awesome CF Containers, and have a section on Compose and a section on Docker files and a section on using Kubernetes, and on and on. So we'll see. There's a lot of things there that I'm not going to show you today. This is not an introduction to that either. So let's quickly look at some demos of just a basic container. And what I'm going to do is in that Awesome Compose GitHub project, I've got folders of the different sort of things that can be done. And the most basic one, they're in like date modified order. But let me go look at this ColdFusion 2021 latest. You can use this latest tag. You don't have to. But anyway, I'm going to show using CF 2021 latest. And I already have that open as another tab. And for those who don't know, Windows 11 now supports tabbed Windows Explorer, which is pretty nice. So we're now in the CF 20. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Let me get back to that one. And open that in a new tab. And bring it over here just to keep it in order. Okay, so here's the CF 2021 latest folder. And in it, I've got a README that you can read about on the website. You can run it at the GitHub and you can see it with more discussion. But it's got a Docker Compose file. And I'm just going to open that Docker Compose file. And this happens to be opening it in Visual Studio Code, which has some nice support for Docker and Kubernetes and ColdFusion that came out in July, August. So if you didn't know about it, Adobe's got a new ColdFusion CF Builder free extension. But again, that's not the focus of this talk. So anyway, here's what a compose file, a simple compose file running ColdFusion could look like. It's only got one service called ColdFusion. That one service is going to use that ColdFusion 2021 image. I'm going to use the latest tag just because there's some simplicity in that, but there's reasons to not use that, to use the real version like 2021.0.5. But moving on, I'm going to publish some ports. Some of you may know that ColdFusion by default has a built-in web server, listens on port 8500. If I want to expose that to my host to be able to run a browser page running against this image once it's running, I tell it, yep, I want to expose it as port 8500. And then there's environment variables, which the help file talked about. And you've got to at least accept the EULA and user licensing agreement. And then if you want to access the administrator, you can set the password for the administrator. I'm going to do that. You don't have to do that. And no, you shouldn't hard code the password here. And especially with Kubernetes, it's much easier to use secrets. With Swarm, you can use secrets and other ways we can do secrets. But again, this is not the focus of this talk. So I'm just hard coding it, keep it simple. Then finally, volumes. If you read the help, you'll see that inside the container is a folder called app. And if you put any CFML code in that container, that code will be available when that container starts. And if we look at this folder, I had an app folder there. I called it app just to keep it simple. I'm mapping my app folder to the folder inside the container. This is stuff which loses people when they're new to Docker. But trust me, once you've used it for a day, you'll start to go, oh, okay, I get it. That's the way it works. So just don't worry. I know it's a little confusing. But in that app folder, I've just got a test.cfm that just does a write, output of hello world. And I've got a dump server.cfm that just does a CF dump of the server scope, and particularly the ColdFusion struct inside of the server scope. So anyway, with that done, I'll close that. With this compose file here, I could go to the command line and do docker compose up, and docker compose would read this and go, oh, let me start a ColdFusion container for you. Well, Visual Studio Code has a nice feature where if you've implemented this Docker extension, I can just right click. When I'm in a compose file, I can just right click and say compose up. So in the background, sorry, I just realized my machine had rebooted. So let me get my Docker desktop. I'm on Windows. You could be doing this on Windows, on Linux, on Mac. It all is the same. So don't worry about that. You notice nothing we're really talking about there in the compose file has anything to do with any OS. I was showing my files as being Windows files. The Docker desktop is a free product for most people. You can read more about that at the Docker website. For most people, it's free. You can definitely use it for free. Anybody can use it for free for learning, for testing, demonstrating things. So you can read the EULA, read the website. But anyway, I'm going to start it up. It shouldn't take long. It takes about 20, 30 seconds to start. And once it's running, then I can go run those compose files that I was trying to run. Here's my little progress bar down here. While I'm waiting, let me see any questions. Nope, still no questions. No comments. Oh, there's something. What is the proper way to set up log folders, error log, mail log, is so that logs are somewhere else, not under the container? Well, again, that's not the focus of this talk. So I'm just going to say, I appreciate the question. While I'm waiting for Docker Desktop to start, I'll try to offer a quick answer. But there's a whole lot I'm not going to cover. And so basically, you would usually set up a volume, like I just showed you. Let me go back to the Docker Compose. I could set up a volume that would be a folder on my host that would be pointing to the logs inside of the container, like optical fusion, C fusion logs. But that's more than I want to get into right now. And then there's other techniques where you can implement commands that push those logs out to what's called the console, and then Docker logs can look at any console logs. Then there's also mechanisms where you can push your logs out to services or other software that manages logs. That's its own, that could be a whole talk itself. So we just won't be able to get into that any further than that. Doug says, I got CF 2021 to run in a container with Docker, but I couldn't figure out how to get to the administrator. Yes, I will be showing you that. So let's go ahead and get this started. Now I should be able to do this Docker Compose up. So I just right click, say Compose up. And down here at the bottom is a terminal window where it shows that it's doing the Docker Compose up. Right there's the command it's running, Docker Compose up, a couple of extra arguments that you don't necessarily need. I could have just said, if I was in that folder, I could have just said Docker Compose up. That's all I need to do. And it would create and then start the container. So now that that container is running, I can go out to my browser. Where's my browser? Here you go. Out to my browser and go to localhost 8500. No, that should have been instant. I don't know. Yeah, that should have been instant. Now, there might have been some momentary stuff that it was still doing to get started. But anyway, we'll see how fast it is when I do some others later. So when I go, in this case, to 8500, that's not really something running, on my computer. It's running in the container, and I've exposed that port 8500 in the container out to my host. Again, let's not go any further than that. I'm now seeing the ColdFusion built-in web server and all the files that either it put in there by default or got mapped by my mapping that volume. And there's that dump server. And if I click that, there's my dump of the server.coldfusion scope. And if I do the test.cfm, there's the running of the hello world, and I can refresh it, and you see it's instantly changing. And I could go into that app folder and change that code, to say, hi there, and refresh the page. And now it says hi there, just so you can get the same sort of experience of editing and developing and stuff. You don't have to rebuild the Docker file. You don't have to, rerun anything. Is if you map a volume the way I did back in this compose file, I mapped that volume. Then if I make changes in the host, they get immediately available inside the container. But again, this is way beyond what I want to get into. I just want to talk about how easy it is to start and run a container. And then as far as the PMT, let me just go to a tab that I have for the PMT right there. So I'll just open up this compose file and show you that in this one, it's a little more evolved. There's a ColdFusion service, just like before, happens to be pointing to a particular one, and some health check. Don't worry about that. It's not important. You don't have to have that. And then there's the PMT as a separate service. PMT has some different ports, has some different environment variables. You can read more about some of this stuff later. Let me just go ahead and run that guy. I'll say, in fact, let me stop the other guy, because you can't have two of them running on the same port at the same time. So I'm going to stop this guy by saying Docker Compose down. And you'll see it goes down pretty quickly. It's stopping it, and in a moment it'll be stopped. Now, let me say again, for those, I see a lot of questions. I haven't read them yet. I know you're going to have a lot of questions about using ColdFusion Docker images. That's not the purpose of this talk. We're not here to talk about them. I'm just showing this to show you how simple it is. I know there's a lot of things I'm not covering. I got to move on. So please hold off on asking questions about using ColdFusion Docker images. I'll do another talk on the online ColdFusion meetup, and we can make it be an open forum for talking about ColdFusion images. So anyway, let me right click and say compose up to this guy. So now he's starting up, and he's starting both the CF service and the PMT service. And there you can see there's the CF1 starting and already started, and there's the PMT running, and he's already started. So the thing here is the PMT is its own service if you installed it on a machine, or it could be on another machine entirely if you wanted it to be. But in this case, it's two different services in the same Docker compose file, and they're talking to each other. And the PMT guy can see the Cold Fusion guy. So if I go over here to my admin and go to where the PMT would normally be at port 9101, make sure I got the right pages and everything. Sorry, that wrong one. This one. No, that's the one. Come on, you. I'm not going to have time to look into this if it's not running. It says it's started, says it's running. It's only been 6 seconds. It could be that it's not quite ready yet. That may be the issue. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. Again, all that stuff's at Docker, also CF Compose. I'll leave you to go look into that. Before I move on, and I'll leave you to run the API manager too, because in the interest of time, I don't want to get hung up in this. But I see in using the CF images, it knows different behavior in Docker desktop windows. Same images fail to build on Linux servers. How to troubleshoot that? Nope, they're the same. The images are Linux images. I was going to talk about that later. The Cold Fusion images are Linux images. There's no reason they should behave differently. Now, maybe your interaction with them, the Docker run commands you do, the paths you provide in a Docker Compose, things like that, there may be things tripping you up. But as far as how they run, they're Linux images. Even though I'm running on Windows, those images are running as Linux containers. The way Docker Desktop works is to set up a VM under what's called WSL. But again, that's not the focus of this talk, so I'm going to move on. You can reach out to me directly for more troubleshooting on that problem. So is the point of Docker that I can have a CF website within CF Docker and run self-sufficient object anywhere? Yes, we could leave it at that. Say yes, that is the point of it. That's not the only reason people use it, but that would be a good reason to use it. In the Docker setup, you typically use Nginx. I'm not going to talk about Nginx in this talk. In my awesome CF Compose, I show an Nginx web server in a Docker Compose with front-end Cold Fusion and reverse proxying the port. Yes. So that's in there as an example on my awesome Compose site. I'll leave it at that. And Chris is confirming that's how they run it. Again, this is very introductory stuff. I wasn't going to show Nginx because that's its own subject, but I cover it in the awesome CF Compose. And that's it for the comments for now. So let's move on. Whew. All right. So again, I said that you've got an app folder within the container, and you can either copy code from your host or from somewhere, from GitHub, whatever. You can copy images into the copy code into the image using a Docker file or using the Docker CP command, or I'm using a volume. You can use bind mounts or volumes if you know the difference, and you can point to that in a Compose file, in a Docker file, or from the command line with Docker run. Again, that's not the point of this talk. I can't elaborate on these points. None of this is new or different. I'm just saying that's the kind of capability you have. This is not an intro to using Cold Fusion Docker images, so I got to leave it at that. Other ways to run them, I've been using VS Code and its Docker extension, but you could definitely do it from the command line with Docker run, if you had Kubernetes, and if you implement Docker Desktop, you get Kubernetes. It's an option. You just turn it on, and now you got Kubernetes. I could run kube control commands or kube control commands that would run these Cold Fusion images in Kubernetes, and it's no more difficult than what I've just shown you. I don't know if I have examples of it up. I think I do, but if not, just follow up with me, and I've got examples I can put up there. You can also use a UI, like Docker Desktop's got a UI that can let you run containers from within it. And Portainer is a very long-standing, popular, and still up-to-date and modern tool for managing Docker containers and images and volumes. So I'll leave you to look into those if you're interested. And again, you can do a Kubernetes manifest that can be managed from all three of the things I've just talked about: command line, Docker extension and VS Code, Kubernetes extension and VS Code, or Docker Desktop. Lastly, I just want to say, I know I'm only showing you Compose stuff. If you're more into doing Kubernetes deployment and you don't care about Compose, there's a free tool called Compose, compose.io. Go to their website. There's free cross-platform apps that you run that will convert a Compose file into a Kubernetes manifest. So you can take what I've done and run it with Kubernetes. Again, that's not the focus of this talk. So I just want to point you in that direction and say, go have fun, knock yourselves out. And you can also run your Docker images locally or via the cloud in things like AWS and Azure, Google Cloud Platform, DigitalOcean. They all offer many ways to run Docker images, or OCI container images, as they're now formally known. And of course, you can use them in doing CI/CD and a whole lot more. That's not the focus of this talk. So again, I'm just leaving you that introductory stuff. Let's move on to how the images have evolved. And I realize now I took half the talk getting to this point. My apologies. But we'll motor through this and still get it all done. So how have they evolved? Well, first of all, the big point is they've evolved, improved in size. In CF 2018 and CF 2016's images, the ones that came out in 2018, 2019, early 2020, and are still there today, CF 2018s are still there today, they're about 600 meg. Each Docker image with ColdFusion, everything in it, is about 600 meg, and that's pretty hefty for a Docker image. In CF 2021, they're only 200 meg. That's quite an improvement, dropped by 400 meg. And the reason is because CF 2021 improved quite a bit regarding modularity. And this is more than just for the Docker images. Some of you may have already experienced this. Depending on how you install CF, you might run into this modularity. It's got this new flexibility, however you deploy it. Now, by default, when you get the Docker image, or if you get what's called the zip file deployment of ColdFusion 2021, they only have the core modules, very core modules, basic things you need. And if you want more, you would want to install additional modules, which we'll talk about in a moment. If you use the full installer, they call it the GUI installer, but it's a command line in Linux. It's not GUI. Anyway, the full installer implements all the modules. So some people never even see this stuff because somebody else installs it or they install it using the full installer. They get all the modules and they move on with life. But the zip install only implements a few core images, and the images only implement a few core modules, my bad. And so there's a tool called CFPM. It's in the CFusion bin folder. I'll hop out to my command line real quick, to this command line. So I'm in my ColdFusion CFusion bin on my host here, my local machine, Windows. ColdFusion CFusion bin has a CFPM command, CFPM. If I say CFPM help, I see the available commands for that CFPM, and you can install packages, you can uninstall them, you can update them, you can list them. Again, this is not the focus of this talk. I could have a whole talk. I will do a talk soon on the CFPM. But the point is you can manage the modules that way or from the CF administrator. And I want to point out, you can also use the CFPM tool to scan your code, and it will tell you what modules you need. And when I say modules, I mean in the administrator, you would see different modules like a search module for doing CF search and related things, a PDF module for doing CF PDF and related things, a SQL Server module for doing querying of SQL Server. There's about 50 different modules you could opt to install or not install, and that can influence how big your ColdFusion is. And you can also export a list of the modules you run, and then with that exported list of what modules a given CF instance runs, you can then import that list of modules into another CF, and we'll see we can import them into a container, as I'll show you in just a moment. So that I already did the quick demo of the CFPM. Here's the key point, is that CF 2021 images from Adobe allow you to automatically pick what modules you want to have pulled in. So there's an install modules environment variable. And in that install modules environment variable, you can name what modules you want to pull in. And I've done an example of that. So let me hop over here. There you go. And if I look at this Docker Compose, again, it could be a Docker file, but I did Docker Compose. And I've created these environment variables, this environment variable called install modules. And I've told it, hey, when you start up, start with the mail module installed and the scheduler module installed. And if I had time, I would run that. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. It would work. Again, this is on awesome CF Compose. You can go run it yourself. That would automatically implement those modules when that container started. So you see, you don't need the administrator. You don't need to go to the admin and click the button to import modules. No, you just do this. Now, that's only one step in the right direction of automated deployment. But before we do that, let me wrap this up. There's also an import modules. Instead of install modules, there's import modules, which would be a file that lists what to import. And you would stick that file into that app folder. And when the container started, it would automatically read that file and import those modules. Well, you could get that list from the export that I just talked about. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip doing that. But I've got a real example doing it. I'll just at least show it to you. Oh, no, I did. There you go. So I showed that to you, the install modules at least. Now, here's the other key point that's really important that you understand, an improvement in configurability versus how it had been with CF 2018 and before. So the modularity controls what CF can do. The configurability is what admin settings are set, managed, added, deleted, whatever you want, modified. And ColdFusion 2021 offers a new mechanism for that. But I want to say first, before we talk about that, even if you're still using CF 2018, you may know in 2016 and 11 had this car file feature where you could create a ColdFusion archive and create that archive in the admin that had whatever you wanted, data sources, mapping, scheduled tasks, put into a car file, and then you could import that car file into any CF you wanted. Well, now you can import that car file, not now, you've been able to import such a car file with the CF Docker images for 2021 and 2018 and 2016. You just place the car file into the images data folder instead. And let me at least show you that compose file. In the interest of time, I'm not going to run it either. So again, it's in awesome CF compose called CF 2021 car setup. And if I look at the compose file, the only difference is I've now mapped a folder called data into the containers folder called data. I have a folder called data. And in that data folder, I have a car file called mappings.car. And this is on Awesome Compose. You can run it yourself. If you were to run this, you would find that the mappings defined in that car file would be automatically implemented in the CF admin. You do not need to go into the admin to modify configuration. You just use these environment variables to do it. Now, that's one way to do it. Another way, all three versions have had, all three Docker image versions for CF back to 2016, had this notion of a setup script environment variable. With the setup script environment variable, you named a file that's a CFM file that will be placed into that images app folder. And then it does whatever you want to do, like call the admin API. And there's an example on that help file of doing that, because they were showing doing that to define a MySQL data source. They were showing it the old way as opposed to the new way, but that's the old way. And again, I've got an example of that. I'll just show you that. Here's the setup script approach. And in my compose file, I point to a file called setupcoldfusion.cfm. It's in that app folder. I've mapped that app folder. So here's the setupcoldfusion.cfm. And it's just a CFML that, again, if we told it to use the password called 123, that's the password it should use. Now, and then it just does a create object, in my case, of doing a set mapping on the admin API extensions CFC. I'm going to leave it at that. I could have a whole talk on the admin API. Some people don't even know it exists. But the point is I'm creating a mapping via code using CFML, and I'm calling that code during the startup. And somebody might go, well, yeah, but Charlie, you're leaving this thing in here. It's got the password. Can't do that. No, you can do that, because there is the option of an environment variable that says delete that file once the container is started. Delete that setup script. So it wouldn't be in the container anymore, for whatever that's worth. Now I see a bunch of questions that have come up. Let me just see. You cover the different license. Yes, I'll cover licensing later. How can we configure data sources and caching in multiple environments we tried using? No, don't use the XML files. You don't want to be messing with those Neo XML files. It is not the right way to do it. You'd want to do what I'm talking about. Either the car file or the setup script, or let me move on now to the better new way. CF 2021's images offer a new way. And that is 2021 offers an entirely new thing called CF Setup. And with CF Setup, you can manage administrator settings from the command line, and you can automate that into a container. So the CF Setup was built into CF 2021, and the script, the script called CF Setup is either built into 2020 or you can download it from Adobe's website, because you can even use it with other versions of CF. Even went all the way back to 10. Yeah, big surprise. And you can use it to manage or view or change or export or import admin settings. So if you're familiar with command box's CF config, it's very similar to that. Of course, CF config's got more capability, been around longer. I get that. But this is what CF provides, the CF setup script. And I'm just going to say, if you're interested in that and it's all new to you and you're like, what? I did a talk back in September called Using Adobe's New, in double quotes, new CF Setup 2. It came with CF 2021. And you can use it with any version of CF. So again, see my talk for more about that. There's the link for it. The bigger point is that CF 2021 images have an environment variable to import the JSON created by an export from the CF setup of a particular server. So you could configure a server the way you want it to be, export its settings with the CF setup export, creates a JSON file, then you name that file to start an image. And there's an import CF settings that names the file that, again, would be a file in the app folder. And I've got an example of that. So again, I know some of you are like, wait, what? I didn't know that was possible. Yes, that's possible. And it's on the awesome Compose already. Import settings. Here's the Docker Compose file for that. And it's really just this one new thing that says import CF settings, pointing to some JSON file. And in my case, I had in there in the app folder a mappings.json file, which just created this test mapping. I'm just making it simple. I'm just defining a mapping. Of course, it could be a data source, could be a scheduled task, could be whatever you want. Okay, so I'll leave you to explore that more on your own. In the interest of time, I got to move on. And then if you did, in creating the export, put a password on it, you can provide that password in a separate environment variable. I talk about that password in the presentation. I'll leave it at that. There you go. So it's the same stuff. Okay, cool. Moving on. So how have the images for CF 2021 changed since their initial release? Well, the first ones came out in 2020. So November 2020 is when CF 2021 came out. It was, delayed because of COVID, and they called it CF 2021 instead of calling it CF 2020. Anyway, since then, you know that CF 2021 has had 5 updates. The last one was last month. And you can read more about those updates at this URL if you weren't familiar with it. There have been 5 updates. And I said each image gets a new image version with each update. So you can particularly point to an image that's using a particular version, and you can easily test things out and say, hey, I'm going to try it with the update 5 and compare it to how it worked with update 3, well, whatever. It's pretty cool, right? That's a great way to use these images to try to sort out problems by not installing and uninstalling images, but by just pointing to different images. And yes, back to the earlier question, the point is you'd package your stuff up and run it as via this image, whether you run it as a volume or copy it into the container with a Docker file. Again, those are not really unique to this discussion, but the point is you can definitely do that. And I showed you how in Dockerhub and ECR, each image had a tag for each different update. And I just want to tell you that update 1 and 2 did address some bugs with the images specifically for CF 2021 and the add-ons images. So there were improvements in those updates, not just general CF improvements, but specific Docker image improvements. Also in update 2, in update 1 and 0, the path inside the container was like Optical Fusion 2021, and they'd been previously just using Optical Fusion, so we wouldn't have to worry about changing things with different versions. So anyway, that got fixed in update 2. And some more stuff. They added some environment variables new in 2021's update 2. So there's now this ability to control the deployment type and the profile and the allowed IP admin IP list. These correspond to things in the CF administrator and installer. The point is now they're configurable as environment variables. Now, they haven't done that with everything in the CF admin. Whatever they don't do, you can modify yourself with the setup script, with the JSON file or the car file. But some of these things are exposed as environment variables, which is nice. And there was a typo difference. An early version of the 2021 update 2 had the first 2 listed as set deployment type and set profile. Now they're just deployment type and profile. Update 3 didn't have any Docker related fixes, but it did have a change related to that deployment type. So they fixed that. And update 4 addressed some Log4j issues in the Cold Fusion images. So that was nice. Update 5 doesn't have any specific images, but I'm going to point out for those that are into this stuff, I noticed that just 5 days ago now, there was a new image released for the CF 2021 update 5. There was one a month ago when it came out. Now there's another one. And I've asked Adobe to let me know what that's about. I hadn't heard back. I just asked last night, so I don't hold it against them that I didn't get the answer. I maybe didn't see it. So anyway, check those out. So then these are the currently available tags, 2021, 5, 4, 3, and 2. That's what you can get from Dockerhub right now. And the 2021 add-ons images have a 3 and a 2. And then the 2018 images have changed also since they first came out. They came out in 2018, obviously. And then the 2016 images came out at the same time. And as of 2018 has been updated, there have been 15 updates. Again, there have been new images for each update that they provided images for. And the discussion of the updates is there. The 2016 images are no longer offered or supported since the release of 2021 in late 2020. So hopefully you're not trying to use those. Adobe's not going to update them at all. They don't even exist. You can't get them from Dockerhub or from the ECR. But there have been some changes to the 2018 images since they first came out. There were some, again, bugs. These kind of match what I described about updates 1 and 2 of 2021 2021, updates 11 and 12 of 2018 had similar bugs that they fixed. The log4j vulnerabilities in update 14. And again, this new image for some reason that came out a few days ago, that's a little different than the original one from a month ago. So be that as it may. They did add some new environment variables in the 2018 image for a serial and a previous serial. Originally, they didn't provide for that in the images. They did add that then. And of course, that's now in the CF 2021 images as well. That update 2 was from like early 2019. So this was a long time ago. I'm just telling you everything that's changed. That's the point of this, is to say, hey, if any of you care, here's how they've evolved. If you go comparing things, here's how they've evolved. And there's currently what's available. Okay, moving on. Yeah. The PMT and the API managers have been updated a little bit. New images and tags for the new versions primarily. There have been some updates of the PMT. If you didn't know it, the PMT does get updates. And there is a UI in 2021. There's a UI for updating it. In 2018, there wasn't until an update that came along. I think it was like update 2 added a UI. Just like the CF admin has an ability to update things now, the PMT has an ability to update things. Anyway, so there have been multiple updates. There are no particular things related to the Docker images for the PMT, but there was one change. They added a new environment variable called password. So you could change what is the password for the administrator. If you don't have that and don't use it, then the default is admin. And, you know, a lot of people just use these Docker images for local stuff. So it doesn't really matter about the passwords. It doesn't matter that they're plain text. But of course, if somebody's deploying these into some version control, then it matters. Or if you're deploying them onto some remote server, then that stuff does matter. And again, Docker and container orchestration solutions like Kubernetes have their own ways of solving making passwords be secrets, and secrets for different purposes like certificates and serial numbers and stuff like that. So again, that's not the focus of this talk. And ColdFusion doesn't have any particular features related to that. But if you can implement your containers in a place that supports secrets, then ColdFusion could, in some ways, leverage those secrets. I'll leave it at that. I also noticed that the images got updated without changing the tag to add that new environment variable. So you'd have to know to go do a pull to get that newer version. Because by default, you can just keep reusing the images over and over and over for weeks and months. And until you tell it to pull down a new one, even if it's changed, Docker doesn't pull it down until you tell it, hey, go get it. Because it assumes that you want to keep the current one that you have. And the username in the PMT is admin. And for now, that can't be changed through any environment variable. And there have been these images for the PMT and these images for the PMT for 2018. Again, they're different images because they're different tools, and these are the different versions that exist. The API manager has barely had any changes, nothing really related to Docker images. So there's 2 images available for the API manager and for both 2021 and 2018. There are different images because the products are different, but there only been one update to each of them. And no add-on updates at all. So there's just one image for each of those. All right, so some wrapping up. These are questions some of you asked. I knew some of you would ask them. We got about 5 minutes, so this is perfect timing. Licensing, the elephant in the room, right? Just like ColdFusion itself, let me say this first, using ColdFusion for development is free. You hear me? Free. Free is in free, free, free. You can use ColdFusion's Docker images for free for development, just like you can use ColdFusion for free for development. That's what the EULA says. You're perfectly in your rights to do that. But, sorry, let me get some water. Many people do just use containers for development and exploration, and they're never going to production. So this licensing doesn't matter to you if you're just using CF for development. But some people are thinking, hey, I might want to deploy this stuff with Docker images in production. So what's the licensing concern then? Well, yes, if you deploy them for production, then just like ColdFusion needs licensing, these images require licensing. And according to the only doc that currently discusses it is a fact page on the Adobe site. And it says that for a CF Enterprise license, you can deploy 8 containers. And for a CF Standard license, each container must be separately licensed. That's what it says. I don't agree with it. I think it's terrible. You know, I don't work for Adobe. I'm just the messenger here. I really hope this will change. There have been arguments that it was going to change, assertions that it was going to change, but it's not changed. Remember, they've been out for 4 years now, and sadly it didn't change with 2021. Who knows? Maybe it'll change with 2023. By the way, if you didn't hear it, 2023 is coming out. The beta or the alpha was just opened up yesterday. I have a blog post I posted last night on that. If you go to my website, you can read more. And who knows? Maybe they'll change the licensing in 2023. We'll just have to wait and see. But for now, it's not great. I mean, if you have an enterprise license, sure, it's cool. You can do 8 containers. That's better than no containers, right? It's better than only 1. And some people can do a lot of stuff with 8, but somebody else will go, I need 80. I need scalability to the max. Well, you're going to have to pay for that. And there's even other issues that as you read the EULA, when you're deploying a cloud, there might be other factors. So it doesn't really say that in the EULA, but you might hear from some people that deploying in the cloud is another whole kettle of fish. That's not discussed in the EULA. It's not discussed in this FAQ. The FAQ is right on the website, and I have a blog post I did back in 2019 where I quoted the FAQ and I pointed to the FAQ. So that's all we have right now. There's nothing else I know of beyond that discussion about the licensing. Does the same apply for Kubernetes? I think you're asking if you deployed ColdFusion in Kubernetes, would this licensing discussion be the same? The answer is yes, because that's just how you're deploying your Docker images, whether you do it in Docker. I mean, frankly, in production, most people won't be running Docker Desktop or Docker Compose. They'll be running in production usually Kubernetes or, ECS or EK, all the different, I told you earlier, AWS and Azure and DigitalOcean and other platforms have ways of running Docker containers that don't involve Kubernetes or that do. So the point is, it doesn't matter. To your question, it doesn't matter. The licensing doesn't matter how you deploy it insofar as whether with a container orchestrator or not. It just says how many you deploy. And with 2021, you have to activate your licenses, and that goes for the Docker image as well. They have to support the activation capability, and they will keep an eye on how many you've deployed, so you can't hide from this requirement. And if you do something wrong, they'll let you know. So we'll leave it at that. Some other issues, I blew by some of these earlier. Let me repeat them now. First of all, the ColdFusion images from Adobe right now only support 64-bit AMD processing, not ARM M1 for those on Macs, for example. But that doesn't mean you can't run the images. There's ways to run our AMD images on ARM machines. But the point is, they're not currently any separate ARM M1 architecture images. And let me just say quickly for those who do care about that, if you go to Dockerhub, they tell you on this tags display, they tell you what architecture it supports. So for now, you only see the AMD 64. If someday they add an ARM one, they will now list the ARM, or what's the other term they sometimes use? M1. They'll say ARM. We all say M1, but the formal name is ARM. They'll say ARM, and now they will be available as ARM-based images. And when you do your Docker pull, if you don't tell it otherwise, it just knows what you're running and pulls down what you can support. So if you do try to run these AMD ones on an ARM machine, you'll probably find they don't work. And that's where there's solutions to that, but they're not Adobe provided solutions. I'm going to move on from that. I will point out that the command box images for both ColdFusion and Lucy, command box Ortus have built M1 based images. So if you're using command box, that's maybe why you haven't seen this be a problem. But let's be clear, then you're using command box's Docker images, which is a totally different discussion. They don't use the same environment variables. They don't use the same, JSON file approach of importing things. And if you wonder how things differ between the Adobe provided images, the Lucy provided images, and command box's versions of the Lucy or CF images, I did a talk at Into the Box this year, and I discuss all that and contrast them and compare them. So I'll leave you to look into that. And for now, the recording is only available for those that are cfcasts.com subscribers, or if you attended the conference, but perhaps in time they'll offer it again, or I might offer it on the ColdFusion meetup. But there's the link for the PDF. We're getting right near the top of the hour. Let me just look and see. Nothing from anybody. Okay. From Purva. I was looking to see if she's about to pull the plug on me. I don't know if this is the first talk for the CF Summit. I don't know if they're going to pull the plug right at the top of the hour or let us go another minute. The images are Linux images. I said that before, and that's not new information if you use Docker. But to those that are new, it doesn't mean you can't run the images on Windows. I'm running the images on Windows. Again, Docker Desktop for Windows. and Linux VMs can run these, and it uses WSL under the covers, and you can do that as another way to implement Docker even. And as far as CFML running on Linux, the only thing you ever typically trip over is case sensitivity of file names. So some people's apps will have no trouble. Some people's apps will fail on the first call, but it's usually just one file name that you're referencing by some file name with a capital letter, that, or vice versa. So anyway, most people will really never notice if they're running their CF on Linux. So that's not a big deal, but there you go. Just like many people don't notice they're running ColdFusion on Java. It's just under the covers. It's hidden from you. But that file name case sensitivity is the one issue where you may trip over that. So finding more help, remember the things I've talked about earlier, the CF Docs page, the resources I mentioned for myself and others. There's no particular community that focuses on the Docker images, any of them really. There's no particular community that does that. So just look at the normal places to get support in the wider community. And on my website, if you go to cf411.com, that redirects to my website, and it's a page of resources and tools. And one of the categories is CF Community Help Resources. And I point you to the CFML Slack, the Facebook community group, ColdFusion group, the LinkedIn ColdFusion group, the Adobe ColdFusion community forums, the Lucy community forums, the Command Box community forum. I point to those things in the CF411 site. So if you're feeling lost and you don't know where to find help, just go check out that URL and you will find there's a whole big heaping hunk of community out there ready to help you. And of course, I can help directly. I'll do some free help to a point. Just email me, reach out to me via Twitter, whatever. And then sometimes I'll say something would be better as consulting. And I work very quickly, as you can see, and I cover a lot of ground really quickly. So in summary, we've seen that the Adobe images have evolved, especially as of 2021. There have been these great improvements in size and modularity and configurability. The images have also evolved in other ways since their initial release. So we covered all that ground, and I've given you a lot of resources for learning more, especially about CF images in particular, and some of them cover Docker in general. And so go check out more about these features that were added. And with that, enjoy the rest of the online CF Summit. This is the first of many to follow. Let me just look quickly. Again, Apurva, you jump in if you have any comment. Thank you for the kind regards to people so far. There was one question: does a container run an API manager count as part of the 8? That's a good question. I don't know. That's not discussed anywhere. The API manager would be its own. It uses the enterprise license, so I would think that it would count as one of the 8. Yes. You should reach out to Adobe for that. Send an email to cfinstall with one L, cfinstall@adobe.com, and they can provide answers to direct questions. Cool. And Apurva said there's no session coming up, but that's okay. I don't mind, ending on time because this will be recorded and I want it to be around an hour. So I'll just look quickly back and see if there's any questions. There's nothing in the Q&A pod. And by the way, Apurva, let that be a lesson. That's where the Q&A pod, some people just don't even think to use it. So having it taking up prominent space and the picture of the person, both of those are really taking away from seeing the content on the screen. So really, I hope you guys will reassess how you've laid that out. I think you'll find people appreciate seeing the content more than anything. And again, thanks everybody for your kind comments. I don't see any further questions, just lots of thank yous. Thank you very much. I don't see anybody care.org/presentations. You'll see I've done past talks on introducing ColdFusion Docker images. And in those, I often talked a little bit more about introductory stuff because I wasn't really getting into this level of detail. I was getting into that particular detail. If CF isn't finding Java when the Java home variable is set, how do we troubleshoot? Well, when you say the Java home variable is being set, the question is, where are you setting it? So this is a potentially difficult one to try to cover quickly here, but let's just clarify. If you're saying you'd like to change the Java version, I'm pretty sure I have on the Awesome Compose an example of that. And it's probably just not doing the way you would think to do it. So let me just look here. Yep. So check this out. If you're watching the screen, Faith, you can see I'm now at, and by the way, I didn't show this earlier because I knew we didn't have time, but this is the site called Awesome CF Compose. It's just a GitHub project of mine. And yes, it starts out with a bunch of folders. That's the way Git works. But then there's the README. And I explain what it is, what it's based on, where I got the idea. And then I list the different kinds of things. So you can look down this list and find stuff. But I just did a Control F on Java. I had added one 2 weeks ago called specific Java version. So if we look at my compose file, actually, I couldn't do it through the compose file. That's right. I remember now. So if I look at the compose file, again, looks pretty normal, just like all the ones we've looked at so far. But if I go back and look at the Docker file, that was where I had to do this. So check out what I did. So first, I'm pulling down, you don't have to do this, but I'm pulling down in the container the particular Java version. You don't have to do it this way, but if you do it this way, you just configure it in the Docker file. So it's pulling it down from Adobe's site. Adobe offers Java, and it offers a version that runs in the version of Linux that this is. So anyway, it gets it, and then it does the install. Now maybe you don't want to do this, but I'm just saying this would work. You get the you get the Java, you install the Java, and then you can set an environment variable. Now, this may be enough for you. You may want to just look at this bottom part. Set an environment variable, maybe not the Java home, but anyway, set an environment variable. And then it's using what's called a Linux SCD command. I wrote this, so if you have any questions, you can follow up with the issues on GitHub. But I just do a replacement of the Java home in the JVM config within the container. I do a replacement of whatever path is currently pointed to with what I pointed to here. So bottom line is, I know what you were doing was setting a Java home and hoping it would just pick it up. It doesn't work that way, but you could probably find that you could modify this to work the way you want. It's really down to this one magic line. So, right. So you could just point to that. Right. So if you've already got it installed in the container, this is the key. If you've got it in the container at opt ColdFusion, wait a minute, opt ColdFusion JRE, that's the default Java location. You don't need to change that. That's what it currently points to by default, opt ColdFusion JRE. If you're telling me you're trying to change what that is, well, that's a different subject. And you really shouldn't do it by copying stuff into that folder if that's what you're doing. That's another whole subject we could get into. But the point is, if you got another Java somewhere in the image, this is how you could point to that. Okay. That's the issue. I don't know. That's the issue is what? Just go ahead and repeat the statement. Because I'm trying to interpret what you're doing, and I'd rather you just tell us what you're doing. Anyway, what I showed you will work for those that are interested in this topic of changing CF to use a particular JVM. This would be how to do it. And ColdFusion does support Java 11, ColdFusion 2021 and 2018 both support Java 11. And this is showing how to run 11.017, which is the current latest version as of October when I wrote this. By default, it's not finding the Java location without any mods to Java. Well, I just want to clarify, Faith, I think whatever you're saying, there's some misunderstanding because by default, it will find the Java location. That's what it does. Everything I'm showing you, if we looked at the CF admin, I don't know if I've got one running right now. I think I might have one running. There you go. Cool. Just quickly, if I look at the CF IDE administrator. I don't know if that's a different password. Crap. But anyway, if I went in there and looked at the Java page, the Java home by default will say whatever it says opt ColdFusion JRE. That's what it says by default. So yeah, reach out by email. We'll be able to sort it out for sure. I hope that everybody listening who stuck around got the more important point is that if you want to change the Java version that ColdFusion works with, just go to my awesome compose and look at the example I have in the Docker file. That tells you exactly how you can do it easily. All right. And I think that's the only question. Yep, there's been no other further ones since then. So I look forward to hearing back. Anybody with further feedback? We're about 10 minutes over now. Let's go ahead and call it and enjoy the rest of the summit. Go check out the website, summit events, whatever it is. I'll just quickly look for it. ColdFusion. I think actually you'd shared it in the chat, right? So look at the first chat and you'll see the link for that. And the time, I'll go ahead and let Apoorva go ahead and stop the meeting. So enjoy the rest of the sessions coming up over the next days and weeks. Until again.